What's often misunderstood in these dynamics is that what appears to be affection is, in many cases, a carefully sustained sense of control. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but consistently. The connection begins in a way that feels genuine, even intense. There is attention, responsiveness, a sense that you are seen in a way you haven't been before, and that's precisely where the foundation is laid. Because the moment you begin to respond consistently, predictably, you are no longer just participating in the connection. You are reinforcing a structure. From a psychological perspective, something subtle is happening. As Carl Jung often suggested in his exploration of the psyche, individuals are drawn not just to people, but to the roles they unconsciously assign to them. In this case, you become the pursuer, the stabilizer, the one who maintains emotional continuity. And in doing so, you unknowingly surrender leverage, not through weakness, but through repetition. Control, in this sense, does not announce itself. It doesn't appear as dominance in the obvious form. Instead, it operates through expectation. She begins to expect your replies, your attention, your emotional availability. And once expectation is established, it quietly transforms into dependence not yours, but hers on your consistency. Yet paradoxically, this dependence creates the illusion that she holds the power, because she dictates the rhythm. Each time you respond quickly, explain yourself, or try to restore balance when something feels off, you are feeding that rhythm. You are confirming that your role is to adjust, to compensate, to maintain. And over time, this creates an imbalance so subtle that you don't question it, you adapt to it. You begin to feel that keeping the connection stable is your responsibility. This is the illusion. Because what feels like emotional investment is, in reality, structural reinforcement. You are not just engaging, you are stabilizing a dynamic that places her at the center of control. And here lies the deeper truth. Control in relationships is rarely seized at, is given piece by piece through unexamined patterns of behavior. The more consistent you become, the more predictable you are, the more the illusion solidifies that she is the one in command. But illusions, no matter how convincing, rely on one fragile condition. They require your participation. And the moment that participation changes, the entire structure begins to tremble. If you look closely, what felt spontaneous was, in fact, structured. Not in the rigid sense of a plan written out in advance, but as a psychological rhythm that repeated itself with quiet precision. The beginning draws you in. There is warmth, attention, a sense of alignment that feels almost fated. You respond to it naturally. Anyone would. But what follows is where the pattern begins to reveal itself. There is a subtle withdrawal, not enough to break the connection, only enough to disturb it. A delay in response, a shift in tone, a slight emotional distance that you cannot quite explain. And in that moment, something activates within you. You lean forward. You try to understand. You adjust your behavior, your tone, your effort, in order to restore what was there before. It feels like care. It feels like investment. But psychologically, it is something more complex. As Carl Jung observed, much of human behavior is driven by unconscious patterns rather than conscious decisions. What you are responding to is not just her, but the tension created by inconsistency. The mind seeks resolution. When something feels slightly out of place, it compels you to act to close the gap, to return to equilibrium. And in doing so, you become more engaged than you were before. This is how the cycle sustains itself. She initiates closeness, you respond. She withdraws slightly, you compensate. The more you compensate, the more you invest. And the more you invest, the harder it becomes to step back, because now there is something at stake. Your time, your attention, your emotional energy. The pattern deepens, not because you are unaware, but because it feels meaningful. It feels like something worth preserving. Over time, this creates a psychological conditioning. You begin to associate effort with reward, uncertainty with motivation. The inconsistency itself becomes the hook. You are no longer just experiencing the connection, you are trying to stabilize it. And in that process, the dynamic quietly shifts. She sets the rhythm, and you follow it, often without realizing it. What makes this pattern so effective is that it does not feel manipulative. It feels relational. It feels human. And that is precisely why it is so easy to remain inside it. But once you begin to see the pattern for what it is not, a series of isolated moments, but a repeating structure, you regain something essential. You regain awareness, and awareness is the first break in any cycle that was never meant to be permanent. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, something shifts. Not in her, but in you. The pattern that once felt automatic begins to feel visible. The same moments that used to pull you forward now invite hesitation. You pause where you once reacted. You observe where you once tried to fix. And without any declaration, without confrontation or explanation, you begin to withdraw your participation. This is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of awareness, because once a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its unconscious hold. As Carl Jung suggested, what remains unconscious governs us. What is brought into awareness begins to loosen its grip. And so your behavior changes not dramatically, but decisively. You no longer rush to respond. You no longer feel compelled to restore every slight disruption. The emotional reflex that once drove your actions starts to quiet, and in its place, something unfamiliar emerges. Restraint. Not indifference, but choice. You are no longer moving in reaction to her rhythm, you are stepping outside of it. And this is where the dynamic begins to fracture. Because control, in its most subtle form, depends on predictability. It relies on your consistency, your willingness to play your role without questioning it. The moment you become unpredictable not through chaos, but through calm detachment, the structure that once held the interaction together starts to destabilize. From her perspective, this shift is disorienting. The cues she once relied on are no longer there. The responses she expected no longer arrive in the same way. There is a silence where there was once engagement, a pause where there was once pursuit. And what makes this particularly unsettling is that it cannot be easily interpreted. There is no clear conflict to address, no argument to resolve, only a change in presence. And presence, when withdrawn, has a weight to it. This is why the shift carries such impact. You have not attacked the dynamic, you have simply stepped out of it. And in doing so, you expose something that was previously hidden. That the connection depended not just on her behavior, but on your participation in sustaining it. What you begin to realize in this moment is that power was never something she fully possessed. It was something that existed between you, maintained through repetition and expectation. And once you disrupt that repetition, even quietly, the entire structure begins to lose coherence. The profound part of this shift is not that you have changed her, it is that you have changed your relationship to the pattern. You are no longer reacting from habit, but responding from awareness. And that difference, though subtle on the surface, is transformative at its core. Because the moment you step outside a cycle, you are no longer controlled by it. What is rarely seen in these moments is what happens internally when control is no longer guaranteed. On the surface, everything may appear unchanged. There may be silence, or there may be a continuation of superficial interaction that looks normal to anyone observing from the outside. But psychologically, something far more active is unfolding beneath that surface. When the expected response does not arrive, when the usual emotional access is no longer available, the mind does not simply accept it. It attempts to restore the previous order. This is not about affection in the romantic sense, it is about equilibrium. The system that once felt stable has been disrupted, and the psyche reacts to that disruption. As Carl Jung often emphasized, the human mind resists imbalance. When a pattern is broken, especially one that has become emotionally familiar, the unconscious does not remain passive. It searches for ways to re-establish what it recognizes as normal. And in this context, normal is not healthy, or rational, it is simply familiar. This is where confusion begins to emerge, not because there is a lack of intelligence, but because there is a loss of predictability. The familiar emotional responses are no longer being mirrored. The cues that once produced certainty now produce uncertainty. And uncertainty, in psychological terms, is deeply uncomfortable because it removes control over interpretation. So what follows is not always direct action, but subtle psychological movement, re-evaluation, reframing, attempts to understand what changed and why. There may be moments of emotional intensity, followed by withdrawal, followed again by attempts to reconnect in some indirect form. These fluctuations are not random, they are the mind trying to regain its former structure of influence. But what makes this stage particularly important is that it reveals dependency that was previously invisible. Not necessarily dependency on a person, but on a role that person played in maintaining emotional stability. When that role is no longer reliably filled, the system becomes exposed. What was once automatic now requires effort. What was once assumed now becomes uncertain. And this uncertainty often feels like loss, even when nothing has been openly taken away. Because what is being lost is not just interaction, it is control over the expected emotional landscape. Yet there is a deeper layer here. In the absence of predictable response, something else begins to surface: awareness of attachment itself. The realization that what was being managed was not simply a relationship, but a dynamic of emotional regulation between two people. And that realization is difficult to ignore, because once you see that much of what felt like connection was also structure, and much of what felt like spontaneity was also pattern, the entire experience shifts in meaning. And in that shift, something irreversible begins to form: clarity about where control truly lived all along and where it quietly begins to dissolve. When the established pattern begins to break, the system does not simply disappear. It adapts. What was once stable and predictable becomes uncertain, and in that uncertainty, new behavior emerges not necessarily out of clarity, but out of instinct to restore what has been disrupted. At this stage, the responses you see are not random. They often come in waves: a sudden increase in attention, a carefully timed message, or an emotional signal designed to reopen a channel that had started to close. Then, just as quickly, distance may return again. This fluctuation is not confusion in the ordinary sense, it is recalibration, an attempt to re-establish the previous balance without directly acknowledging that the balance has changed. From a psychological perspective, this is where the structure tries to repair itself. As Carl Jung observed, when a psychological system is destabilized, it does not immediately let go of its former organization. Instead, it resists dissolution by activating compensatory behavior. In simple terms, when one form of control weakens, the system attempts to recreate it through alternative means. This is why the behavior may appear inconsistent. It is not a lack of intent, it is a shift in strategy. If direct emotional access no longer produces the expected response, indirect pathways are explored. If attention no longer guarantees engagement, emotional triggers may be reintroduced in more subtle forms. These can appear as nostalgia, selective vulnerability, or sudden reappearance after silence. But what is important to understand here is the underlying motivation is not always conscious manipulation in the dramatic sense. More often, it is psychological discomfort with loss of influence. The absence of predictable emotional response creates a kind of internal imbalance, and the mind naturally seeks to restore what once provided a sense of control or certainty. At the same time, something else is happening on the other side of the dynamic. The person who has stepped back is no longer responding from instinct, but from observation. And this changes everything, because now the attempts to re-engage are not met with the same emotional availability as before. They are seen more clearly, not necessarily resisted, but no longer absorbed in the same way. This creates a tension that is difficult to resolve. One side is attempting to restore a familiar structure, while the other is no longer fully participating in it. And without mutual reinforcement, the system begins to lose coherence. What makes this phase significant is that it reveals the difference between influence and dependency. Influence requires presence and responsiveness. But when responsiveness is no longer guaranteed, influence alone is no longer enough to sustain the dynamic. And so what you witness is not chaos, but transition. A structure trying to preserve itself in the absence of the very participation that once gave it form. And in that transition, the truth becomes increasingly visible. Control is never static, it exists only where it is continuously reinforced. What ultimately becomes clear, when you step far enough back from the emotional intensity, is that the real shift was never about her reaction, it was about your withdrawal from automatic participation. Most people assume power is something that one person holds over another. But in psychological reality, power is far more fluid. It exists in the exchange, in the pattern, in the repeated behaviors that both people unconsciously agree to maintain. When that agreement is broken not through confrontation, but through disengagement, the entire structure changes. You stop reacting in the way you used to. You stop reinforcing the cycle. And in that silence, something important happens. The dynamic loses its fuel. As Carl Jung often implied in his work on consciousness and unconscious patterns, transformation does not begin with force, it begins with awareness. The moment you see a pattern clearly, you are no longer fully inside it. And once you are no longer fully inside it, you are no longer governed by it in the same way. This is where the real power shift occurs, not in her emotional response, but in your psychological independence from the cycle itself, because what once felt automatic now requires conscious choice. You are no longer reacting to every signal. You are no longer interpreting every silence as something that must be fixed. There is space now between stimulus and response, and in that space your behavior changes fundamentally. From the outside, nothing dramatic may seem to happen. There is no visible collapse, no obvious confrontation, but internally, the structure has already changed. You are no longer a participant in the same way you are an observer, and observation removes immersion. It creates distance, not emotional coldness, but clarity, and this clarity is what dissolves the illusion of control. Because control only exists where behavior is predictable, where responses are automatic, where emotional patterns remain unexamined. The moment you introduce awareness into that system, predictability weakens. And without predictability, control becomes unstable. What follows is not victory over someone else, but release from a system that required unconscious participation. You begin to realize that much of what felt like emotional intensity was actually repetition, and repetition, once recognized, loses its power to dominate perception. At this stage, the most important transformation has already occurred internally. You are no longer trying to restore what was lost, nor are you reacting to what is offered. Instead, you are no longer defined by the cycle at all, and that is the deeper realization. The moment you stop needing to participate in a dynamic to understand it, you are no longer bound by it. Because true psychological power is not in controlling the other person, it is in no longer being controlled by the pattern itself.